Far more than we think. Making Sense of Spirituality by Michelangelo. Chapter 27. May the Force be with you. The key theme in all the Star Wars films is the ability of the Jedi and Sith characters to access a mysterious force which gives them great power and ability. The Force was thought to flow through all living things, but it could only be harnessed by those who were force sensitive and practiced its use. Since the films were produced, the field of quantum physics has moved on apace, and amazingly, there are now scientific theories that describe exactly such a force. Research is ongoing in the area of unified field theory, but basically it's becoming increasingly well established that there is an underlying force field that is the basis of all energy and matter. The science fiction is gradually becoming potential science fact, and this in some ways is no surprise, because it's happened many times before as scientific knowledge has progressed. I'm going to attempt to explain my understanding of the logic behind unified field theory, but please forgive me if my explanation contains errors or omits key points. My purpose is not to present a perfect summary of the latest status in scientific thinking, but more to give a flavour of what there is out there beyond our everyday experience. My personal view is that the force described as the unified field is the same as the universal energy of life, which in turn is the same as spirit. The unified field is the force that unifies us. It is the source from which everything arises. The unified field is that which we are. It is therefore my belief that even a basic understanding of this science adds enormously to the credibility of spirituality. Science is leading us back to the wisdom that's been there all along. We need to build up a picture of unified field theory that makes sense to those of us without a PhD in physics. This is perhaps my key challenge in writing this book, because if the science makes sense, then this provides solid ground on which to build a model for life that is based on spiritual principles. The starting point is to consider the upward and downward scaling of physical life that already exists in our perception. Scaling up, as we rise upwards in our minds, we go from location to area, county, country, continent, planet, solar system, galaxy, and so on to infinitely large scale. Each level is a larger scale version of the one below. And likewise, if we drill into our physical selves, we go from body to limb, muscle, fibre, cell, molecule, atom, nucleus, and down further into infinitely small scale. So the world as we experience it simply sits at a point along the massive scale from infinitely small to infinitely big. The key point here is that however gigantic the big stuff is, it's all made from the small stuff. The macro is made up from the micro. The building blocks of all matter are unimaginably small. Whatever scientific theories we embrace, they have to be able to describe the infinitely small and the infinitely big, as well as the finite world that we perceive through our limited senses. Another way to think about this is if we draw a circle on a piece of paper, and then within that circle we draw a series of equally sized smaller circles to occupy the space. We can then repeat that same pattern within each of the smaller circles to create yet more smaller circles. Each time we have a smaller circle, we can repeat the pattern again and create still smaller circles. Our drawing is limited by the width of the pencil lead, but mathematically there's no end to the number of iterations that can take place. The number of potential iterations is infinite, and hence the circles can become infinitely small, and there can be an infinite number of them. Each tiny circle can theoretically contain a byte of information, and we can therefore have an infinite amount of information within our original finite circle. Our original circle could easily be one of the circles within an even bigger circle, and that bigger circle could be within a yet bigger circle, and so on, ad infinitum. This simple example shows how we can have finite boundaries within an infinite scale, and also how there can be an infinite amount of information within a finite space. This means, by the way, that there are an infinite number of potential divisions within each of us, and the possibility for an infinite amount of information. This opens the door to the possibility that we are beings of infinite potential. An interesting thought that arises from this idea of infinite subdivisions is that we will never get down to the smallest known particle, because there will always be yet smaller components. The ongoing work at the Large Hadron Collider near Geneva to split the atom into ever tinier pieces is slowly proving that this is the case. In the chapter on energy and matter, we covered the concept that 99.9999% of atoms, and hence all matter, is in fact empty space. Not only are there vast amounts of space separating physical objects in the universe, the physical objects themselves are almost entirely comprised of space. Space is pretty much all there is. Traditional thinking tends to define space in terms of the distance between material objects, or the volume enclosed by physical boundaries. Given the relative proportions of space and matter, it seems more logical to define matter in terms of space, rather than space in terms of matter. Space is the thing that unifies everything. Well, most of us have heard the Big Bang theory, whereby the universe exploded into existence from a single point and continues to expand ever outwards. Given that every action has an equal and opposite reaction, questions arise as to what could have fueled this gigantic explosion in the first place, and how all of that energy got compressed into a single point. This problem led physicists to explore the possibility that space itself contains energy and mass, and, to cut a long story short, the conclusion is that space is infinitely dense. In the chapter on perfect balance, we looked at the idea of how positive infinity and negative infinity add up to zero. This same concept applies to the density of space. When energy vibrates, it has mass, or weight, and all vibrations are simply oscillating waves of different frequencies and wavelengths. The peaks and troughs of a wave cancel each other out and add up to zero. So a cubic centimetre of space can be thought of as containing an infinite amount of energy vibrating at an infinite frequency, with infinitely small and large wavelengths, thus producing infinite mass. The whole thing adds up to zero, so it appears to be a vacuum, but is actually infinitely dense. Well, this makes no sense to us experientially, but the complex physics and mathematics prove it to be true. Space at any volume is infinitely dense and contains infinite energy and mass. Well, this has major repercussions for our understanding of the universe. If we now think about space as a simple spectrum of energy vibrating at infinitely small and large wavelengths and frequencies. The midpoint of the spectrum at zero is what we perceive as the vacuum. Vibrations at other wavelengths and frequencies on this spectrum of possibilities produce matter as we perceive it, and also the various forms of energy that we experience, such as light and heat. These things that we experience are therefore just small sections of the infinite spectrum of wavelengths and frequencies that exist. We only have to think about infrared signals from a remote control to acknowledge that frequencies of energy do exist that we can neither see nor feel. So what we now have is an infinite number of possibilities, all arising from what seems to be empty space. Everything emanates from the vacuum, including all energy and matter as we perceive it, and much more besides. And this includes our physical selves. The countless atoms that make up the trillions of cells that comprise our physical bodies and brains emanate from nothing. We are just vibrations and a small part of the infinite spectrum of space. This all sounds like science fiction, but complex calculations have been made to show that the same theoretical infinite mass exists in a single atom as in our entire universe. Each level is not only a scaled up version of the level below, but each of them is essentially the same thing. The space inside an atom is effectively the same as the space of the whole universe. Everything is the same thing. Everything is one. We are all versions of the same thing, and we all emanate from the same source. We are all one, and are all connected through space to each other and all that is. This infinite density of space also means the same amount of information can be held in an atom as exists in our entire universe. All knowledge can theoretically be contained in a single atom. All potential knowledge is therefore within. There's nothing more without than there is within. As above, so below. This provides a simple explanation for why we only have to look within ourselves to find everything there can possibly be. Given that our world exists within a fraction of the spectrum of all possibilities, it doesn't take much of a leap in logic to see the potential for other worlds to exist at other points on the spectrum. We're not talking about physical worlds that we could perceive with our senses, because these would exist at our point on the spectrum. We're talking about worlds at different points and worlds beyond our earthly perceptions. This gives us the logical basis for the existence of parallel universes. These universes are not elsewhere, but right here with us, occupying the same space. They are simply vibrations of energy at wavelengths and frequencies that we cannot experience from our point on the spectrum. And this opens up the possibility of moving between parallel universes by changing the vibration of our existence. We established in the chapter on senses that our experience of physical reality actually takes place entirely in our minds. Every sense, thought and feeling boils down to tiny pulses of energy. If these thoughts were to change vibration, then logically they ought to be able to access different points on the spectrum of possibility. And also, the wider the gap in vibration from the usual frequencies, then presumably the more different the experience would be. We would start to perceive things differently, and perhaps perceive different things. Our experience of life would change, as has been reported by countless mystics throughout the ages. Well, this is the point where scientific theory meets spiritual experience. This is the logical explanation as to why our thinking can directly influence not only our experience of reality, but also reality itself. I had no idea this link existed when I began my spiritual journey, but having now discovered and researched it, I find that it makes perfect sense. The penny drops when ancient wisdom slots perfectly into a modern scientific framework. Well, science continues to evolve, and who knows what discoveries will come next. For example, I understand that it's been mathematically proven that protons spin around each other at the speed of light within the nucleus of an atom. So you could argue that we ourselves are made of light. Linear movement on our planet becomes incalculable when you add the speed of rotation of the Earth to the orbit of the Earth around the Sun, to the orbit of the Sun within the galaxy, to the orbit of the galaxy within the cluster, and so on. We may even be travelling at the speed of light whilst we sit still. The prospects for such things as energy extraction from space and travel beyond our world are all coming into view at the same time as humanity seems hell-bent on self-destruction. Scientific progress is all very well, but fundamentally all we're doing is discovering what's already there and then using that knowledge to make life easier and more comfortable for the minority. Humankind may or may not survive its own version of ego-driven self-abuse, but as individuals we retain the freedom of choice as to whether we wish to pursue our own path of spiritual growth. Spirituality assumes there is a spirit power within each of us that is the universal energy of life. Science is now telling us that space itself is this universal energy, and that life as we experience it is just a fraction of all that is possible. Maybe science will one day afford humankind access to a life beyond our current dream, but personally this does not concern me, because my experience is that spiritual practice can achieve miracles right now when we tune our minds to it. So the universal energy force of life emanates from the infinite density of space and manifests itself in countless ways. It's our ability to be consciously aware of this reality that gives purpose to our lives. We are the way in which life experiences its own expression. We are the windows through which the universe can see and experience itself for what it is. Each of our lives is unique, and therefore each of us is equally important. No single life is any more or less important than any other. We all count equally. I need not be concerned that the force may or may not be with you. The force is always with you, because you are the force. We are the force, but oftentimes we don't acknowledge this, because the fearful ego is too busy worrying about itself. We are far more than we think. The ego blocks us off from the light of the universal spirit within.